This original WSRE presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you.
Across the autism spectrum, Dr. Temple Grandin and Anita Lesko on this edition of Conversations. Autism awareness has greatly increased in recent years, but how many of us really understand autism? On this edition of Conversations, we'll discuss the autism spectrum with two experts, Temple Grandin and Anita Lesko. Temple Grandin is considered a leading authority on autism. She is the author of numerous books on the subject and is a sought-after speaker. Her life story has been told in a television movie entitled Thinking in Pictures, starring Claire Danes. She's been featured on numerous national media platforms, including 60 Minutes. Her latest book is The Autistic Brain, Thinking Across the Spectrum. In addition to her work with autism, she is an international expert on the humane treatment of livestock. Anita Lesko was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome at the age of 50. Since that time, she has been on a crusade to educate others about Asperger's. She is the author of the book, Asperger's Syndrome: When Life Hands You Lemons, Make Lemonade. She is featured in Temple Grandin's book, Different, Not Less. She is also the co-author of an upcoming book entitled Been There, Done That, Try This, An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Planet Earth. Recently, she was one of the organizers and speakers at the Flying High with Autism Conference in Pensacola, Florida. The conference attracted such noted personalities as Dr. Temple Grandin, Dr. Stephen Shore, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. We welcome Anita Lesko and Temple Grandin to this edition of Conversations. Thank you so very much for joining us.
Great to be here.
Pleasure.
Let me ask you first off to explain what is autism.
Autism is a very big spectrum. And when I was 2.5 years old, I had all the standard autism symptoms, no speech, rocking. Fortunately, I was put into a very good early intervention program. Now, you work on kids really hard when they're little. They kind of go off into two groups. You got the ones on the higher end of the spectrum, and some of those have no speech delay, but they're socially awkward. That's going to be like half of Silicon Valley. And then you got the other end of the spectrum where they don't learn to talk, and they're going to have much more severe handicaps. It's a very, very big spectrum going from very, very handicapped all the way up to the people that invent things like television cameras.
And how does Asperger's fit into the syndrome?
Asperger's is classified in the higher end of the autism spectrum, and difficulty with social interactions is the biggest issue that's associated with that, and a great amount of sensory issues, like we're kind of living life in Dolby surround sound would be one way I try to explain to people what it's like living with Asperger's.
Tell me what your childhood was like, Temple.
Well, I can remember the frustrations of not being able to talk, and then I just would pitch a big tantrum. And I was, fortunately, my mother found a really good speech therapy school that two teachers taught in the basement of their house. And they did a lot of ABA type of things where she'd hold her a cup and she'd say, now say cup. She'd go cup, and then she'd go cup, and she'd enunciate the words because you got to slow down. When grown-ups talk really fast, I didn't hear the hard consonant sounds. You got to slow down when you talk to these kids. And gradually, by the time I was 4, I was fully verbal, and socially awkward. But in the 50s, when I was being brought up, kids were taught manners. Kids were taught to shake hands. Kids were taught, all of these things in a much more systematic sort of way. I'm seeing too many smart kids on the autism spectrum that aren't learning basic skills, like shaking hands, how to order food in restaurants, how to shop, just some of these very, very basic things.
What would your advice be to teachers and parents how to change that?
Well, develop a kid's strengths. If he's good at art, I was good in art. My mother and my teachers always encouraged my ability in art, and I was encouraged to do lots of different things. And then my ability in art became the basis of my career on designing cattle handling facilities. Because basically what I did with the livestock industry, I'm an industrial designer. I do the visual thinking. Another kid might be good at math, but have difficulty with reading. There's a tendency for these kids to have uneven skills, good at one thing, bad at something else. And then another kind of mind is the word thinker. The word thinking. And in my book, The Autistic Brain, I talk about the different kinds of thinking and present scientific research to show that these different kinds of thinking actually do exist.
I read where you said you think in pictures. Is that true for both of you?
Yes.
Elaborate on that.
Well, my mind kind of works like Google for images, and I think in very specific pictures. Okay, pretend I'm Google for images. Give me a keyword, not something ordinary like house or car. Be a little more creative than that, and I'll tell you how my mind accesses information.
Okay, technology.
Technology, I saw the cover of a magazine I get called Technology Review. I'm now seeing the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I'm now seeing my grandfather, because he was the inventor of the automatic pilot for airplanes, and he went to school at MIT. Okay, you see how I got from technology to my grandfather? It's associative thinking. It's not linear.
What was your childhood like?
When you're talking about thinking in pictures, when I was in elementary school, I would spend most of my day looking out the window, and there was a big green pasture out there, and I would envision on my movie screen brain that I was on a big white horse galloping across that field with the horse's mane blowing in my face, and I could feel that sensation of the wind blowing on me and see this beautiful image going on the screen. And then, of course, the teacher would call my name several times because I wasn't paying attention. And finally, when I would look at her with a blank look on my face, and they would think I was probably the least smart child in that room because I seemed like I didn't know the answer, but it was because I was looking out the window at the beautiful movie that was going on out there.
Now, see, on the surface, you tell me that, I would think of you being very kind of creative type folks, artistic, maybe actors or artists or whatever, but both of you are in very scientific fields in your real life.
Well, in the autistic brain, I explain how, in terms of my visual thinking, I have the mind of an artist, but I've got the temperament more of an engineer. Because I use my art ability to do more engineering kinds of things. And when you do engineering projects and technical things, you're going to need somebody on the project that's a visual thinker and is not going to be able to do math. That's not me. I flunked algebra, couldn't do it. But you're going to need me, because I would have never put the generators for the emergency backup power for the Fukushima nuclear power plant in a non-waterproof basement. That is why 4 nuclear reactors burned up, because they didn't visualize water coming in over the seawall, flooding the basement and wrecking the generators. Yeah. I wouldn't have made that mistake. I can't design a nuclear reactor. That's up to the mathematicians. But you need visual thinkers like me on the tech team to avoid messes like Fukushima.
And Anita, you're in the healthcare industry. So how does that play? It's obviously very scientific.
Giving anesthesias, you have to learn, of course, all the pharmacology of all the different drugs, and there's a lot involved with giving anesthesia and technical skills of insertion of intravenous lines and all different kind of monitoring. And the knowledge of all different kind of disease processes and illnesses and everything to take into account when you're doing anesthesia. And that is like a very scientific thing, but it's also an art to anesthesia as well. And for my artistic part of my brain, I've just recently taken up painting with acrylics, which I'm madly in love with, and I'm already envisioning pictures in my mind that are already painted in my brain.
Here. And you're doing all the difficult brain surgeries. You're doing some of the most important, really critical anesthesia because you're really good at it.
Right. I love, part of it having Asperger, you love details.
Right.
All kind of details. So, of course, I like cases that involve a lot of detail, which cases like brain surgery, neuroanesthesia kind of things, where there's going to be all kind of aspects for anesthesia-wise that we have to do special to accommodate the neurosurgeon's needs for how they need the brain shrunk down. There's different things we can do with drugs and techniques to do all that, and I just thrive on that. That's my cup of tea, because there's all kind of things to keep in mind and keep you busy and doing all kind of things. That's very exciting.
I want to jump back talking about math for 1 second. You said, by the way, you had a tremendous TED Talk. If folks get an opportunity to Google TED Talk in Temple Grandin, it was amazing. Every teacher should definitely hear this, but hear the TED Talk. But you were talking about that you flunked out of algebra and that you couldn't go on to geometry or trig, but you thought you'd have probably been good in those.
Well, this is a mistake that's made. Us visual thinkers have difficulty with algebra, and you need to jump these kids right into geometry. So how did I get through college?
Yeah.
Well, Mother kind of worked out a little local college to get me in there sort of on probation. But what saved me is in '66, when I was in college, algebra was not required. Nationwide, it was finite math, which was probabilities, matrices, and statistics. I took 2 semesters of finite math, ton of tutoring. I got through it with B as in Bravo, using the aviation term. And if I'd had to take 2 semesters of college algebra, I would have been sunk. I can thank the finite math fad of the '60s.
What about you, Anita?
Mathematics is my worst subject. I somehow managed to get through there enough to get through, but no, I'm not any by means. And when I take a year of physics, But there's really, that was just not my thing.
Brings me back, though, I'm curious of both of your thoughts on our education system. In my view, I think in so many ways our education system is broken because if you don't fit in a little box, it's like you get tossed in this direction or that direction. How do we change that?
Well, I think we're going to, there's an awful lot of kids where a 2-year community college degree in auto mechanics is where they ought to be. And I think taking the hands-on classes out of the schools is the worst thing they ever did. Because if I hadn't had art and sewing and wood shop, those were my favorite classes. And, we need people that can do those sort of hands-on things. We have a shortage of things like electricians, welders, plumbers, auto shop, diesel mechanic, huge shortage of the highly skilled trades. And in the work that I've done on livestock handling, there's a lot of steel and concrete design. Oh, I love working on construction and seeing my things built. And when you're a weird geek, so how did I sell myself? I'd show people my drawings. Yeah. And then when they saw my drawings, they go, oh, wow, you did that. Yeah. Oh, and by the way, the autistic brain's got 2 beautiful drawings in it.
2 beautiful drawings.
Yes, because when you're a weird geek, you got to sell your skills and your ability rather than selling yourself.
Interesting. And what about for you, Anita? What was, as you launched into your career, how did you choose your career in medicine?
My career actually kind of found me. It's kind of a long story of how I ended up becoming a nurse anesthetist. I was in college getting my Bachelor of Science in Nursing. I was also doing ice dancing at the time. And I fell and broke my arm, ended up in the hospital, had to have an anesthesiologist come to give me a little sedation while they set my arm, asked me what am I learning in school for. I said to get my bachelor's degree in nursing, and he said, why don't you go to be a nurse anesthetist? And I said, what's that? I didn't know what it was. So then I found out what it was, and then when I found out how all the things that would be involved, and I was like, ooh, this really sounds exciting, and then I learned more about it, and then I applied for that. I went to Columbia University in New York City. I graduated in 1988, and I've been working full-time for the past 25 years doing anesthesia, and I've done over 40,000 cases to date. Wow. And with Temple saying about how you have to sell yourself, in my career, I always, when you have Asperger's, advice I give to parents is tell your child to, whatever it is that they choose to do, they have to be the best at what they do. Because you are different, you're oftentimes for a target of bullying in the workplace and different things like that. So if you do an excellent job at your job, you can't go wrong doing that.
Yeah, and the thing is, all the neurosurgeons wanted you.
You're talking about the bullying issues. How should parents and teachers deal with that?
Well, one thing that was done, mother and the teachers in my little school got together, and they explained to the other kids when I wasn't there that, I didn't have a handicap that you could see, like having braces or a wheelchair. They needed to help me with some of the social things. That can help. And then when it comes to bullying online, this is where parents need to get together and stop it. And then there's some kid needs to have his Facebook account shut down because it needs to just be stopped. I was teased a lot in high school, and the thing that saved me was the shared interest things. We got to get these kids into things like 4-H, FFA, band, school play, art, computer clubs, things like hackerspace, things like maker community groups where they make cool stuff with technology, where you get those shared interests. Because when I was out riding horses and I was in Model Rocket Club, there was no teasing. We got to get them into those shared interest groups.
You want to add to that, Anita?
When I was young, horses I always feel saved my life because I couldn't, when you have Asperger, you cannot interact with your peers of your age group, especially when you're younger. I couldn't interact at all with classmates. I had nothing in common with them. When I was got involved with horses, which I'm still into as today, then the other peers that were my age, they're also involved in the horses and they love the horses. So then we could talk all about horses and we, got to interact like that, and there was that shared interest. And again, parents need to encourage their children to get involved in something that they're interested in, and then they're going to have other kids their own age, and everybody's going to be so interested in that thing, whatever kind of club or musical instrument or whatever it is, that they're going to focus on that and not be with all the bullying issues.
Anita told us how she got into medicine, but how did you get into the business of working?
I started out originally as a psychology major, and I wanted to be an experimental psychologist. But in my college, I took 2 semesters of animal behavior at Franklin Pierce College from a retired Harvard professor. And that was maybe started to plant one of the seeds. Then I went out to Arizona State, tried to get a master's in psychology, and that's when that didn't work out so good. I squeaked by with statistics with a C, and then I discovered feedlots and animal science. You know, it's if I hadn't gone out to my aunt's ranch, you know, when I was in high school, I would have never gotten introduced to the cattle industry. This is where if we want to get kids interested in things, we got to get them out of the house. Got to get them out doing things. There's too many kids today sitting at home playing video games. And the other thing I want to emphasize is learning work skills. This needs to start in middle school. When I was in middle school, Mother set up a little sewing job with a freelance seamstress, and I hemmed dresses 2 afternoons a week. When I was 15, I was cleaning horse stalls, and they set up having me go out to Arizona to do work on my aunt's ranch. I was doing carpentry projects. I was shingling the barn roof. Internships in college, like working in a research lab and renting my own house. But Mother and the professor set this stuff up. Parents have got to get in there and grease the skids, okay? Like maybe talk to the guy who owns a little computer shop to bring this Asperger 14-year-old in and have him work in that little computer shop. I talked to one mom, and she was like working like this with the manager at the local McDonald's. And when her daughter didn't behave, she had extra ice cream machine duty. They were working together on this. That's the sort of stuff that we've got to like just set up.
Do you want to piggyback on that, Anita?
Like I spent my youth as a working student at a big horse stable up in New Jersey where I lived, and mucking out stalls was a biggest part of that. But it was you mucked out X amount of stalls to get X amount of riding time, and I wanted to learn to ride to go in jumping competition over really high fences, like 6-foot high fences. So the motivation to do that was astronomical. So I mucked lots of stalls, painted fences, picked rocks out of pastures, whatever needed to be done, I did it. And that's the kind of thing that people need to encourage their children. They have to, because how are they going to have a work ethic to go out later in life as an adult and work?
We need to start training that early. I wish paper routes were still around, but I've thought up some things for a new paper route. How about work out with a couple of neighbors that the kid's going to have to walk a couple of dogs every single day? Okay, here in Florida, how about clean swimming pools? And something where you got to do it every day, or you do it every week if it's cleaning swimming pools. Learning sort of the discipline of work skills.
You said and you may have said it on a couple places, but I saw it with Leslie Stahl on CBS 60 Minutes. She basically asked you if you could be cured of Asperger's, would you?
I like the logical way I think, so I don't want to be cured of autism. I like my logical thinking. But on the other hand, I'm seeing too many young people on the high end of the spectrum getting all hung up where autism is becoming their total interest, and they're not interested in other things. I'd rather have young kids come up to me and tell me they love astronomy or they love training dogs. You know, because autistic kids tend to get fixated on their favorite things. And what you got to do is broaden out those fixations. If he likes trains, let's teach reading with trains. Okay, let's read about a place where a train goes. Okay, see how I'm making an associative link back to the favorite thing, trains?
Right. But you said, too, that without the autistic brain, we might not have some of the wonderful things that we have in today's society.
Well, let's think about back in the caveman days. The social yakety-yaks around the campfire did not make the first stone spear. Yeah. And what I think is, brain can either be more thinking or it can be more social. And there's a certain point where a little bit of autism or Asperger trait is just part of normal variation. When does geeks and nerds turn into mild autism? There's no dividing line. You know, half of Silicon Valley's got a touch of autism. I go to a lot of TV stations and a lot of radio stations. I've seen people in engineering. I know of a touch of autism. Anita, this station would fall apart if you didn't have it.
Anita, tell your story, because you were, I guess, officially diagnosed with Asperger's at 50?
At 50.
What led up to that? I mean, so you had no idea. How did that come about?
I always knew that I was different, and I just knew that I didn't fit in. But I always thought it was just me. I never really gave it much thought. Actually, I just kind of always forged ahead and did whatever my special interest led me to next. And one day, a coworker, her son, she was having problems with him, took him to a neuropsychologist, and she comes back and she said, "My son has Asperger's syndrome." I had never even heard of that word. I said, "What is that?" So she hands me these papers, and I'm reading. I'm like, "Lisa," I said, "why does this sound like me?" Now, this woman had known me for like 10 years already, and she looks at me, she goes, "You're right, it does." So that night I stopped at the bookstore, get every book they had about Asperger's syndrome, and by the next morning I knew that I had an Asperger's syndrome. And then I went to a neuropsychologist, and you had to go through like over a couple of days, all like 10 hours worth of testing with IQ tests and all the tests that they make you go through to get your official diagnosis. So they hand you a piece of paper and say, yes, you really do have Asperger's syndrome. And I'm glad I didn't know until I was 50, because I worry when I see a lot of young people, they focus on that label, and it's like they become fixated on that they have a label and they've got Asperger's, and I would rather, I'm glad I didn't know, because I did a lot of exciting things, like fly in an F-15 fighter jet, because that became one of my fixations, military aviation photojournalism. And if I knew I had Asperger's, I might have spent too much time at home, like these kids are, sitting on a computer and just doing wasteful time things and focusing on, oh my gosh, I've got Asperger's, instead of out there doing things.
Well, I think what's kind of amazing is the fact that, I mean, you were diagnosed at 50. You're not too much older than 50 right now. And you've written one book.
Just finished another.
Just finished another. You've organized a conference, or certainly been a part of the organization of a conference. Mm-hmm. So you really have the ability to focus. And then obviously, Temple, you've done amazing things on a global basis with animals.
Well, I've also worked on implementing the McDonald's animal welfare program, because it's, you can get people to buy the equipment, put in the equipment. Half the cattle in this country are handled in equipment I've designed, but you got to get people to run it right. So about 10 years ago, I worked with people at McDonald's on auditing the plants to make sure they actually do things right. And if you're interested in that, you can go on my website, Grandin.com, just my last name, Grandin.com, and lots of stuff on livestock in that.
Interesting, interesting. What do you guys make of the fact that apparently the number of autism cases are rising? In other words, statistics say there are more people.
I think on the mild end of the spectrum, it's just increased detection, because I know lots of people that are gray hairs like me, undiagnosed on the spectrum. Now, I want to emphasize, autism is not precise. In my book, The Autistic Brain, I go over the history of the DSM, that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that's used by psychiatrists for diagnosis. Every decade or so, they kept changing the diagnosis. In fact, now they're going to take Asperger's out and call it social communication disorder, but it's the same thing. Nobody's changing the diagnosis for tuberculosis. The thing is, these diagnoses are based on behavioral profiles of clusters of symptoms. And the main thing that determines being someone on the autism spectrum on the mild end is real socially awkward and tending to have fixated interests or repetitive behavior. It's a behavioral profile. And it's not precise. It's not like having tuberculosis, where you get a very precise diagnosis.
The talk of vaccines, your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't even want to discuss that subject, because then everyone gets all hung up on that, and we don't talk about the stuff that I'm really interested in, like jobs.
Talk to me about jobs.
All right. Obviously, of course, autism is a very big spectrum. And you've got people that are very severe, that may not be capable of doing a job out in the workplace, maybe capable of doing shoulder type of job. Then you've got the other half of the spectrum that's fully verbal. And I think we need to start teaching work skills starting around age 12, like walking dogs for the next door neighbors, and you do it every day and you're going to get paid to do it. It needs to be work outside the home. We've got to start setting things up in the informal economy. And when they're 16, they can go into the informal economy when they're young.
Sure.
Formal economy when they get older. I was shingling the horse barn roof when I was 16. Mm-hmm. I was painting signs for our winter carnival. And then that morphed into a freelance sign painting business. And some of the very first freelance work I did was painting signs for the carnival. That was a lot of silly things, like the Himalayan ice monster, real silly stuff. But I was learning these work skills, learning, how to sell yourself. Freelance work is a good thing. Then I started writing for the Farm Ranchman magazine, and I just went up to the editor and I told him I had done my thesis work on cattle handling and feed yards and where they'd be interested. And people say, well, how did you get the guts to do that? Gets back to when I was 8. Mother would have me put on my Sunday best dress. She'd have dinner guests over. I'd shake hands. Good evening, Mr. Wood. No, it wasn't Holty. It was Mr. Wood. And I'd shake hands with him. And then I served hors d'oeuvres to my mother's guests. That taught social skills. We've got to get in and we've got to get them off their duffs, and they got to get out and do work. The other thing is I had terrible problems with anxiety, horrible panic attacks. That's been controlled now with antidepressants. And sometimes I'm very careful. Conservative use of a little dab of Prozac to stop some of that anxiety can really make a big difference. But you want to use medicines carefully and conservatively. There's way too many drugs given out to little kids.
Interesting. Anita, you want to piggyback on that a little bit?
There's a huge number of people, and the numbers that I've tried to look it up very recently, and it still appears to be the same number, that only 10% of people with Asperger's are working.
Only 10%?
Only 10%, and the rest of the people are out there collecting disability. Now you have people that are physically healthy, and I've seen it on people come in a support group and they sit there, people that are in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, and talk about they being on a computer all night, looking at, Googling whatever happens to strike their fancy, while they're collecting disability. And I kind of sit there and looking at them like, and then people seem to find the therapists and counselors where they can go, people who will fill out their paperwork that will enable them to get that disability. We need to get the people out there working. Sooner or later, the government's going to run out of disability funding to be given out for that. And
well, then I want to emphasize, you've got people on the very severe end of the spectrum, nonverbal, cannot live independently. They need the Social Security check.
They need the Social
You see,
Security.
this is the problem.
Right.
You've got a very big spectrum, but you see, where are all the gray hairs? There's tons of gray hairs out there that are on the milder end of the autism spectrum that have been able to keep employment. And I've worked with them in the meat industry. Like they run the maintenance shop, they raise cattle, they do welding, they do metal fabrication work, they fix computers, they do the accounting.
Fascinating. What a fascinating discussion. We're out of time. Your website is?
My website for autism is templegrandin.com, and my livestock website is grandin.com, just my last name.
Your website, Anita?
bornwithaspergers.com.
All right. Thank you so very much, both of you. It was a real pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you for having us.
It is absolutely our pleasure. Anita Lesko, Temple Grandin, joining us today discussing Asperger's and autism. And once again, we can you can check out both of their websites. Just Google their names. Both of them will pop up. By the way, you can see more of our conversations online at wsre.org/conversations. I'm Jeff Weeks. Thank you so very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the broadcast. Take great care of yourself, and we'll see you soon.
Support for this program is provided in part by these corporate sponsors. And by viewers like you.